In this powerful story about racism in America, Dr. Simone Ellison, a prominent black surgeon, faces relentless prejudice and systemic injustice when a racist police officer falsely accuses her of criminal activity. What begins as blatant harassment escalates into a dangerous power struggle as Simone uncovers a corrupt plan to displace vulnerable families in her community. With her reputation and safety on the line, Simone confronts the deeply entrenched biases that protect the powerful while oppressing the vulnerable, revealing the infuriating reality of racism and abuse of power that so many endure. Will she find justice against overwhelming odds? The town of Cedar Mills had its secrets, buried deep in the soil of its quiet streets and tidy lawns. For Detective Lila Hart, the weight of those secrets pressed against her every step as she parked her car in the precinct lot, the morning sun breaking through the fog like a reluctant confession. The past week had been a whirlwind. Her promotion to lead investigator came with congratulations that felt hollow, side-eyed glances from her peers, and whispered doubts about her capabilities. Cedar Mills wasn't used to seeing women of color rise through the ranks, much less in law enforcement. Lila knew what they thought. She must be a diversity hire. But she also knew better than to let their murmurs distract her. Today, however, the tension in the air wasn't just from her. The department buzzed with unease, officers huddling in corners, their hushed tones betraying a shared anxiety. Something was wrong. As Lila stepped into the building, her partner, Detective Marcus Lane, intercepted her. His face was grim, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by a rare seriousness. "You heard?" he asked, his voice low. "Heard what?" Lila responded, already bracing herself. Marcus glanced around before leaning in. "There's been another one, Southside same signature as the others." Lila's stomach tightened. Another one. The phrase hung heavy between them, pulling her thoughts into a dark spiral. It wasn't just a murder. They were dealing with a pattern, a series of crimes that the department was trying desperately to keep under wraps. But each new victim brought the truth closer to the surface. "And," Marcus added, his voice dropping further, "they're calling in reinforcements from the state. They don't think we're handling it fast enough." Lila's jaw clenched. Reinforcements translation. "They don't trust me to lead this investigation." "Let me guess," she said, her tone sharper than intended. "They think a new face will magically solve the case." Marcus didn't answer, but his silence was enough. Lila inhaled deeply, steadying herself. She couldn't afford to let the frustration show. Not here, not now. "Where's the scene?" she asked, slipping on her coat. "Industrial District, Warehouse 17, Marcus replied. "They're waiting for us." Lila nodded and started for the door, her thoughts already racing. This wasn't just about solving a case anymore. It was about proving herself in a world that seemed determined to doubt her. But as she climbed into her car and pulled out onto the street, she couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows of Cedar Mills were darker than she'd imagined, and that something, or someone, was watching her every move. The city of Westbridge was a paradox of progress and preservation, its gleaming skyscrapers casting long shadows over cobblestone streets and historic storefronts. For Dr. Simone Ellison, the duality of her hometown mirrored her own life, a delicate balance between her towering achievements and the unshakable roots of her modest beginnings. As one of the most renowned cardiothoracic surgeons in the country, Simone was no stranger to accolades. Her name was etched on the walls of prestigious hospitals and whispered in the halls of medical schools as a symbol of brilliance and resilience. Yet, for all her accomplishments, she still preferred the small, unassuming diner on 3rd Street over the private, 5-star establishments that her peers frequented. She eased her car, a sleek, unpretentious black sedan, into a narrow parking spot outside Joe's Diner. The vehicle was a gift from the hospital board, a token of their gratitude for her groundbreaking work. Despite its understated exterior, the car's quiet hum and plush interior hinted at its luxury. Simone had laughed when it was presented to her. "This is too much," she'd said, though she accepted it graciously. She drove it sparingly, always conscious of how people might perceive her success. The diner door jingled as she stepped inside, the warm scent of coffee and sizzling bacon wrapping around her like a familiar embrace. Joe himself greeted her from behind the counter, a broad smile splitting his weathered face. "Morning, Dr. Ellison," he said, wiping his hands on his apron. "Usual spot?" Simone nodded, her own smile lighting up her face. "You know me too well, Joe." He chuckled, motioning toward a corner booth with its worn leather seats and view of the bustling street outside. "Some habits are worth keeping." Simone slid into the booth, the vinyl creaking softly under her weight. She glanced around, taking in the usual morning crowd, construction workers hunched over steaming mugs, an older couple sharing a plate of pancakes, a young mother trying to keep her toddler entertained with a handful of sugar packets. It was a slice of life that grounded her, a world apart from the sterile, high-stakes environment of the hospital. Joe approached with a steaming cup of coffee. "You're slumming it today," he teased, placing the cup in front of her. Simone laughed softly. "You know I can't resist your cooking." As they chatted, the door jingled again, and Simone's attention drifted to the new arrivals. A man and a woman, both dressed in tailored suits, scanned the room with an air of casual authority. They carried the confidence of people who expected to be noticed, and when their eyes landed on Simone, their expressions flickered with faint surprise. The woman approached first, her stride purposeful. "Dr. Ellison?" Simone set down her coffee and rose, extending a hand. "Yes, and you are." The woman smiled tightly. "Rachel Collins, I'm with Westbridge Financial. This is my colleague, Adam Green." Adam stepped forward, shaking Simone's hand with a firm grip. "We're sorry to intrude, but we've been trying to reach you regarding a potential partnership opportunity. It's a significant initiative, and we believe your involvement could make all the difference." Simone gestured for them to sit, her curiosity piqued. "I'm flattered, but I'm not sure how I fit into your world. Financial partnerships aren't exactly my area of expertise." Rachel's smile widened, though it didn't reach her eyes. "You underestimate the influence of your name, Dr. Ellison. Your reputation as a leader and advocate for equity in healthcare aligns perfectly with our project. We're focused on expanding access to affordable medical facilities in underserved communities." Simone's brow furrowed as she considered their pitch. "It's an admirable goal, but I'd need more details before I commit to anything." Rachel nodded. "Of course, we'll set up a formal meeting at your convenience." As they exchanged contact information, the door jingled again, and the diner's atmosphere shifted subtly. A man in his late 50s entered, his uniform neatly pressed, a badge gleaming on his chest. Officer Brent Wallace. He was a fixture in the community, known for his rigid demeanor and quick judgments. Simone felt his gaze land on her table, his eyes narrowing slightly as he approached Joe at the counter. "What's she doing here?" Wallace's voice wasn't loud, but it carried across the room like an accusation. Simone caught the edge of his tone, the subtle undercurrent of disdain that was impossible to ignore. Joe frowned, glancing toward Simone. "Dr. Ellison." "She's having breakfast, same as anyone else." Wallace didn't respond immediately, but the way he turned to scrutinize Simone spoke volumes. His posture was rigid, his expression tight, and though he said nothing more, the message was clear. "You don't belong here." Simone kept her composure, her hand steady as she sipped her coffee. She'd seen that look too many times to count. The way people like Wallace let their biases seep into their interactions. It didn't matter that she was one of the most accomplished individuals in the city. To him, she was just a black woman, in a diner that, by his unspoken rules, wasn't hers to claim. Rachel and Adam exchanged uneasy glances, clearly sensing the tension. Adam cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Well, we won't take up any more of your time, Dr. Ellison. Thank you for hearing us out." Simone nodded, rising to shake their hands again. "I'll be in touch." As they left, Wallace stepped closer, his presence looming. "Dr. Ellison," he said, his voice heavy with false politeness. "Didn't expect to see you here." Simone met his gaze evenly, refusing to let him unnerve her. "It's a free country, Officer Wallace. Or did I miss the new rules about where I can eat breakfast?" A flicker of irritation crossed his face, but he recovered quickly, offering a tight smile. "Just making sure everything's all right, you know, keeping an eye out." "For whom?" Simone asked, her tone calm but sharp. Wallace hesitated, his veneer of authority cracking for a split second before he turned away, muttering something under his breath. He retreated to the counter, but the unease he'd left behind lingered like smoke in the air. Simone exhaled slowly, her hands tightening around her coffee cup. Joe approached, his expression apologetic. "Don't mind him," he said quietly. "Wallace thinks he owns this place." "I'm used to it," Simone replied, her voice soft but steady. "People like him don't scare me, Joe. They just remind me why I do what I do." Joe gave her a small nod, his respect for her evident. "You're stronger than most, Dr. Ellison. Don't let him get to you." "I won't," Simone said, though the weight of Wallace's scrutiny still pressed on her as she finished her breakfast. As she left the diner, the morning sun was brighter, the streets busier, but the encounter lingered in her mind. It was a reminder of the quiet battles she faced daily, not in the operating room, but in the world at large. Battles where her authority, her identity, and her place in the world were questioned simply because of the color of her skin. Simone climbed into her car, her reflection in the rearview mirror, one of calm determination. She'd built her life on proving people wrong, on defying expectations, and tearing down the barriers others tried to place before her. Today would be no different. She started the engine, her thoughts already turning to the day ahead, and the challenges waiting to test her resolve. Once again, Simone's day had barely begun, but the encounter at Joe's diner lingered like a bad taste in her mouth. She had learned long ago how to compartmentalize moments like that, tucking them into a mental drawer labeled "deal with later." But the weight of Wallace's gaze and the subtle smirk on his lips refused to be shut away entirely. Her next stop was Westbridge Medical Center, where she was scheduled to deliver a keynote address to a group of aspiring surgeons. Simone had worked tirelessly to create opportunities for young people of color in the medical field, knowing from her own experience how crucial representation was in breaking down systemic barriers. As she strode through the hospital's gleaming lobby, heads turned, some with recognition, others with curiosity. A security guard near the entrance, a middle-aged man with a buzz cut and a clipboard, watched her approach with narrowed eyes. He stepped forward as she neared the elevators. "Ma'am," he said, his tone professional but pointed. "Can I help you?" Simone paused, adjusting the strap of her leather satchel. "I'm Dr. Ellison. I'm here for the surgical symposium." The guard's eyes flicked over her tailored blazer and modest heels, then back to her face, his expression skeptical. "Do you have ID?" Simone reached into her bag, her movements deliberate, and produced her hospital-issued badge. "Here you go." He took it, scrutinizing the photo and name as if searching for a flaw, a mismatch, some reason to deny her. Simone stood patiently, though her jaw tightened ever so slightly. This was routine. The unspoken rule of her life. Prove yourself first. Always prove yourself first. After a long pause, he handed the badge back. "All right, elevators to your right." "Thank you," she said, her voice measured. She took her badge and turned toward the elevators, keeping her head high. The guard's scrutiny burned into her back, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of looking over her shoulder. Inside the elevator, Simone let out a slow breath, her fingers brushing over her badge. The hospital was practically her second home. She had spent countless hours saving lives and mentoring young surgeons within its walls. Yet here she was, treated like an outsider, a potential intruder. "It doesn't matter what you achieve," she thought bitterly. "They'll still find ways to question you." The elevator dinged, and she stepped into the conference center on the 5th floor. The atmosphere here was a stark contrast to the lobby. Warm smiles, handshakes, and the occasional selfie request greeted her as she made her way to the podium. She pushed aside the tension in her chest, focusing on the faces of the eager students in the audience. Her speech was everything she had planned, engaging, inspiring, and filled with practical advice. By the time she finished, the room erupted into applause, and she felt a flicker of pride. These moments reminded her why she fought so hard. Here, she was seen for who she truly was, her value undeniable. But the reprieve was short-lived. As Simone stepped out of the conference room and into the corridor, she spotted Rachel Collins waiting by the elevators. The sight of the Westbridge financial representative immediately brought back the guarded tension from earlier. "Dr. Ellison," Rachel greeted her with that same tight smile. "I hoped I'd catch you before you left. Could we speak privately for a moment?" Simone hesitated, then nodded. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Rachel led her into a nearby lounge, where the two women settled into leather armchairs. Rachel's demeanor had shifted, her confidence now tinged with hesitation. She fiddled with the strap of her purse before speaking. "I wanted to clarify something about our earlier conversation," Rachel began. "You see, some of our board members had questions about your involvement in the project." Simone's brow furrowed. "Questions such as?" Rachel hesitated, clearly choosing her words carefully. "It's just that some of them are concerned about public perception. Your work, while groundbreaking, is often associated with activism. They worry that it might draw unnecessary attention to the initiative." Simone stared at Rachel, the words hitting her like a slow, creeping wave. "Unnecessary attention," she repeated, her tone calm but laced with steel. Rachel nodded quickly, mistaking Simone's restraint for understanding. "Exactly. You're a polarizing figure, Dr. Ellison. We're not sure if that aligns with the image the board wants to project." Simone leaned forward slightly, her gaze locking onto Rachel's. "So let me get this straight. You sought me out because of my reputation, my name, and my accomplishments. But now you're concerned that the very things that make me qualified might tarnish your project?" Rachel flinched, her composure faltering. "It's not personal," she said weakly. "It's just complicated." Simone smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "No, Ms. Collins. It's not complicated. It's quite simple. You want my influence without my identity. You want my name without my voice." Rachel opened her mouth to respond, but Simone stood, cutting her off. "If your board is too afraid to stand behind someone who represents change, then perhaps they're not ready for the kind of progress they claim to seek. Excuse me?" Without waiting for a reply, Simone walked out of the lounge, her head held high. The anger simmering beneath her skin begged for release, but she wouldn't let it consume her. Not here. Not now. Back in the lobby, she approached the exit, only to be intercepted once again by Officer Wallace. He stood near the sliding doors, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "Leaving already?" he asked, his tone laced with something between mockery and suspicion. Simone stopped, meeting his gaze with quiet resolve. "Was there something you needed, Officer Wallace?" He shrugged. "Just doing my job, making sure everything's in order." Simone tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing. "Do you make it a habit to follow up with every visitor? Or just the ones who look like me?" Wallace's jaw tightened, the thin veneer of professionalism cracking. "There's no need to get defensive, ma'am." "And there's no need for you to question my presence here," Simone shot back, her voice firm but measured. "If you're looking for trouble, Officer Wallace, you're wasting your time." The tension between them hung thick in the air, the lobby suddenly feeling far too quiet. A few passers-by slowed their steps, their curiosity piqued by the exchange. Wallace seemed to notice the attention, and took a step back, his expression hardening. "Have a good day, Dr. Ellison," he said finally, the words stiff and begrudging. Simone nodded once. "You too." She stepped through the sliding doors, the cool air outside brushing against her skin. As she walked toward her car, her composure remained intact, but her hands trembled slightly as she unlocked the door. Once inside, she allowed herself a moment to breathe, her fingers gripping the steering wheel tightly. Simone's day wasn't over. It rarely was. The constant pushback she faced was exhausting, but it also fueled her determination. She had fought too hard, climbed too high, to let people like Wallace or Rachel Collins undermine her. As she drove away from the hospital, the city's skyline loomed ahead, its gleaming towers a testament to ambition and resilience. For Simone, it was also a reminder of the battles she had yet to fight. Battles against prejudice, ignorance, and the systems that perpetuated them. But she wasn't one to back down, not now, not ever. The soft chime of Simone's phone jolted her from her thoughts as she pulled into her driveway. She glanced at the screen. A text from Marcus Lane, her younger brother, and a public defender in the city's justice system. "Marcus. We need to talk. Something big. Can I come by?" Simone sighed, the weight of the day pressing harder. Marcus rarely asked for impromptu meetings. It wasn't his style. Whatever he wanted to discuss, it was serious. She texted back a quick affirmative and stepped inside her house. The air was cool and still, her sanctuary from the chaos outside. Minutes later, Marcus arrived, his usual sharp wit replaced by an air of urgency. He looked worn, his tie loosened and his shirt sleeves rolled up as though he'd been fighting the system all day, which, knowing him, he probably had. "You're not going to like this," Marcus said as he stepped inside. Simone poured him a glass of water and gestured for him to sit. "That's not the most comforting way to start." Marcus shook his head, setting the glass down untouched. "It's about Westbridge Financial." Simone stiffened, but kept her voice even. "I had a feeling you'd say that Rachel Collins paid me a visit today." Marcus leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Did she tell you what they're really doing? Or did she wrap it in a nice little bow about underserved communities and access to care?" "She mentioned something about expanding medical facilities," Simone said, her tone cautious. "What's the angle?" Marcus pulled out his phone and opened an email, sliding it across the table. "They're planning to buy out a major chunk of Southside's real estate, targeting low-income neighborhoods for redevelopment. The facilities are a front. They'll drive out residents, jack up property values, and sell the land to private developers. It's a gentrification scheme, Simone, plain and simple." Simone's stomach dropped. She skimmed the email, its contents confirming her worst fears. The company wasn't interested in healthcare equity. They were interested in profit. "They approached me because they thought my name would legitimize it," Simone said, her voice tight with anger. "They wanted me to sell this lie to the public." Marcus nodded grimly. "They're banking on your reputation. If you endorse it, they'll look untouchable. But if you speak out, they'll retaliate," Simone finished. She leaned back, her mind racing. The stakes had shifted dramatically. This wasn't just about her integrity. It was about protecting an entire community from exploitation. The next morning, Simone called Rachel Collins. "Ms. Collins," Simone began, her tone clipped, "I've reviewed your proposal, and the underlying documents. I won't be lending my name to your project." Rachel hesitated before responding, her tone tight with forced politeness. "I'm sorry to hear that. May I ask why?" "You and I both know this isn't about healthcare access. It's about gentrification. I won't be complicit in displacing people from their homes." Rachel's facade cracked, her frustration bleeding through. "Dr. Ellison, I hope you realize the consequences of refusing us. We've invested significant resources into this initiative. If you speak out against us, it could—" Simone cut her off. "Are you threatening me?" There was a pause, then Rachel sighed. "Not at all. I'm simply advising caution. These matters can become complicated." Simone ended the call, her resolve hardening. If Rachel thought intimidation would silence her, she was sorely mistaken. Simone's next move was to visit Southside herself. The neighborhood buzzed with life, a stark contrast to the polished sterility of Westbridge's upper districts. Children played on cracked sidewalks, their laughter rising above the hum of passing cars. Street vendors called out their wares, and elderly residents sat on stoops, watching the world go by. She stopped at a community center, where she was greeted by Monica Flores, a social worker who had been fighting to keep Southside intact for years. "It's good to see you, Dr. Ellison," Monica said, shaking Simone's hand. "I heard whispers about Westbridge Financial sniffing around. Are they serious?" Simone nodded. "They are. And their plans could devastate this community." Monica's face darkened. "We've been trying to push back against developers for years, but it's hard. They've got money, lawyers, and connections. All we've got is each other." "Sometimes," Simone said, her voice firm, "that's all you need. But you won't be fighting alone this time." The fight escalated faster than Simone anticipated. Within days of declining Westbridge Financial's proposal, she began receiving veiled threats. Anonymous emails warned her to stay in her lane. A reporter cornered her outside the hospital, asking pointed questions about her reputation for controversy. Then, one evening, she found herself facing the most overt attack yet. Simone had just finished her shift and was walking to her car in the hospital parking lot when she noticed two uniformed officers standing nearby. One of them was Officer Brent Wallace. "Dr. Ellison," Wallace called, his voice dripping with false civility. "Could we have a word?" Simone hesitated, but approached cautiously. "What's this about?" Wallace's partner, a younger officer with a nervous energy, held up a clipboard. "We received a report of suspicious activity linked to your vehicle." Simone's jaw tightened. "Suspicious activity? My car's been parked here all day." Wallace smirked. "Just following up on a tip. Mind if we take a look inside?" Yes, Simone said, her voice steady. I do mind you don't have a warrant. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, but Wallace stepped closer, his hand resting on his holster. You're awfully defensive, Dr. Ellison, if there's nothing to hide. Officer Wallace, Simone interrupted, meeting his gaze with unflinching resolve. You have no legal grounds to search my vehicle, either produce a warrant or leave me alone. Wallace's smirk faltered, but he didn't back down. We're just doing our job. And I'm doing mine, Simone replied sharply. If you have a legitimate concern, file the paperwork. Otherwise, I suggest you stop harassing me. Their standoff drew attention. Hospital staff exiting the building paused to watch the exchange. Wallace noticed the growing crowd and finally relented, though his glare promised retribution. This isn't over, he muttered as he turned away. No, Simone said softly, her voice carrying a quiet power. It's just beginning. Back in her car, Simone's hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel. The blatant harassment was infuriating, but it also fueled her determination. Wallace wasn't acting alone. He was part of a larger system intent on silencing her. Simone knew what she had to do. She picked up her phone and dialed Marcus. Marcus, she said when he answered, her voice firm. It's time we need to go public. Simone and Marcus worked late into the night, crafting a statement that would expose Westbridge Financial's plans and the systemic biases that enabled them. By dawn, the statement was ready, and Simone braced herself for the fallout. She posted it on her professional social media accounts, accompanying the statement with a video of herself speaking directly to the camera. Her voice was steady, her words precise as she called out the corruption threatening Southside and the forces attempting to silence her. This isn't just about one neighborhood, she said, her gaze unwavering. It's about a system that prioritizes profit over people. I refuse to stand by and watch as communities are destroyed, and I won't be intimidated into silence. The video went viral within hours. Support poured in from activists, community leaders, and even some of her colleagues, but the backlash was swift and brutal. Anonymous threats flooded her inbox, her car tires were slashed, and then came the summons, a formal complaint filed against her by Westbridge Financial, accusing her of defamation. As Simone stood outside the courthouse, flanked by Marcus and Monica, the weight of the fight pressed heavily on her shoulders. But she also felt something else, a rising tide of support. Dozens of Southside residents had gathered in solidarity, holding signs that read, "Justice for all, and protect our homes." Simone took a deep breath, her resolve unshaken. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for everyone who had ever been dismissed, underestimated, or silenced. The courthouse doors loomed ahead, a portal to what would undoubtedly be one of the most challenging battles of her life. But Simone Ellison was ready. The courthouse's marble steps stretched before Simone, like the mouth of a beast waiting to swallow her whole. The hum of the gathered crowd was a dissonant mix of support and skepticism. On one side, Southside residents held signs, their faces defiant and hopeful. On the other, clusters of Westbridge Financial supporters and local officials whispered behind their hands, eyes sharp with judgment. Simone adjusted the strap of her bag, feeling the weight of more than just documents inside. Beside her, Marcus radiated nervous energy, his phone buzzing with messages from reporters. Monica stood on her other side, a pillar of quiet strength, her gaze scanning the crowd for potential trouble. "Are you ready for this?" Marcus asked, his voice low. Simone didn't answer immediately. Her heart was racing, but her resolve was ironclad. "I don't think it's about being ready anymore," she said. "It's about doing what needs to be done." The heavy courthouse doors opened with a groan, and the trio stepped inside. The hallway was bustling with activity, lawyers clutching briefcases, clerks shuffling papers, and the faint echo of distant conversations. At the far end of the corridor, Rachel Collins stood with a group of Westbridge Financial's legal team. Her sharp, tailored suit and perfectly styled hair were a stark contrast to the predatory gleam in her eyes. Rachel spotted Simone and approached, her expression a practiced mask of calm professionalism. "Dr. Ellison," she said smoothly, extending a hand. "I didn't think you'd come without legal representation." Simone ignored the handshake, her gaze unwavering. "I'm here to tell the truth, Ms. Collins. I don't need a team of lawyers to do that." Rachel's smile tightened, but she recovered quickly. "You're brave. I'll give you that. But bravery won't protect you from the consequences of your actions. Simone leaned in slightly, her voice low enough that only Rachel could hear. Neither will greed. The barb landed, and Rachel's composure faltered for just a moment. Without another word, Simone turned and walked toward the courtroom, Marcus and Monica flanking her. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with tension. The judge, a stern man with salt and pepper hair, presided over the proceedings with an air of impatience. Simone took her seat at the defendant's table, the weight of every eye in the room pressing down on her. Westbridge's lead attorney began with an opening statement that painted Simone as reckless, unprofessional, and a liability to the community. He spoke of defamation, financial losses, and how her accusations had damaged their reputation. Simone listened silently, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She knew this was their strategy: to discredit her, to make her seem unstable and unreliable, but she wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. When it was her turn to speak, she rose, her voice steady. Your Honor, I'm here today not because I made false claims, but because I exposed the truth. Westbridge Financial's project is not about healthcare or community development. It's about profit at the expense of vulnerable families. I refuse to stand by while they displace an entire neighborhood under the guise of progress. The courtroom murmured, and the judge rapped his gavel. Order! Simone continued, her gaze sweeping the room. I have documents, testimonies, and evidence that prove their intent, and I'm willing to risk everything to make sure the truth comes to light. Her words hung in the air like a challenge. Across the room, Rachel Collins exchanged a tense glance with her legal team. The battle lines were drawn, and Simone could feel the tide beginning to shift. As the hearing continued, the tension reached a boiling point. Westbridge's attorneys grilled Simone relentlessly, questioning her motives and credibility. They brought up old articles, twisting her activism into a narrative of recklessness. But Simone met every accusation with grace, her answers calm and unwavering. Monica was called to testify next. Her voice shook at first, but as she spoke about the impact of Westbridge's plans on Southside residents, her passion grew. She detailed stories of families who had lived in the neighborhood for generations, only to be threatened with eviction and rising costs. They're trying to erase us, Monica said, her voice breaking. And they're using people like Dr. Ellison as pawns to make it seem like they care, but they don't. They never have. The courtroom fell silent, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. During a brief recess, Simone stepped into the hallway for some air. She leaned against the cool marble wall, her mind racing. She had held her ground so far, but the real test was still to come. Westbridge had deep pockets and powerful connections, and she knew they would stop at nothing to silence her. Marcus approached, his expression troubled. You're holding up well in there, he said, but I'm worried they're throwing everything they have at you. I know, Simone replied. That's why we have to be smarter. Before Marcus could respond, Officer Brent Wallace appeared at the end of the hallway, his presence like a dark cloud. He sauntered toward them, his smirk as infuriating as ever. Dr. Ellison, he drawled, his voice laced with condescension. Didn't expect to see you here, thought you'd be too busy stirring up trouble. Simone straightened, her expression cool. If you're here to gloat, Officer Wallace, you're wasting your time. Wallace chuckled, his hand resting casually on his belt. Just keeping an eye on things can't be too careful, you know. Careful? Marcus interjected, stepping between them. Or intimidated? Wallace's smirk faltered, but before he could respond, a bailiff appeared to summon them back into the courtroom. Wallace lingered for a moment, his gaze hard and unreadable, before turning on his heel and walking away. As the hearing resumed, Simone noticed a subtle shift in the room. The evidence she had presented, a series of leaked emails from Westbridge executives, had started to poke holes in their narrative. The emails revealed discussions about maximizing profits and streamlining the transition of current residents. The tension on Westbridge's side was palpable. Rachel Collins looked visibly uncomfortable, her usual poise replaced by a flicker of panic. The judge leaned forward, his brow furrowed as he reviewed the documents. Ms. Collins, he said, his voice sharp. Care to explain these emails? Rachel stood, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Your Honor, these communications are being taken out of context. They reflect standard business practices, not malicious intent. Simone seized the moment. Your Honor, these emails are part of a pattern of exploitation and deception. Westbridge Financial is not interested in serving the community. They're interested in profiting from its destruction. Her words sent a ripple through the courtroom, the tension reaching its peak. For the first time, Simone felt the weight begin to shift in her favor, but she knew the battle wasn't over yet. As the day's proceedings came to a close, the judge announced that a decision would be rendered the following morning. Simone felt a mix of relief and anticipation. She had done everything she could, but the outcome was far from certain. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown larger. Supporters cheered as Simone emerged, their voices a beacon of hope in the gathering twilight. But amidst the cheers, she noticed Wallace standing on the edge of the crowd, his gaze fixed on her like a predator, sizing up its prey. Simone squared her shoulders, refusing to be cowed. This fight was far from over, and she was prepared for whatever came next. Here's the climactic confrontation section of the story. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the final day of proceedings began. The judge's expression was unreadable as he entered, his gaze scanning the room. Simone sat at the defendant's table, her heart pounding, but her resolve unshaken. Across the aisle, Rachel Collins and her team looked equally tense, their facade of control cracking under the weight of the evidence presented against them. Marcus leaned over, his voice low. "This is it. You've got them on the ropes." Simone nodded, her eyes fixed on the judge. "Let's hope it's enough." The judge rapped his gavel, bringing the room to order. "Before I render a decision, I will allow closing statements from both parties. Westbridge Financial, you may proceed." The lead attorney rose, his tone polished but strained. He reiterated their claim that Simone's statements were reckless and defamatory, accusing her of jeopardizing a project designed to benefit the community. His words felt hollow, especially after the damaging emails that had been revealed the day before. When it was Simone's turn, she stood with quiet authority. She spoke directly to the judge, but her voice carried through the room, resonating with every person present. "Your Honor, this case isn't just about me. It's about a community that has been overlooked, undervalued, and systematically exploited. Westbridge Financial's project isn't about progress, it's about profit, no matter the cost to the people they claim to serve. The evidence speaks for itself. I urge you to see past their polished words and recognize the harm they're trying to inflict." Her words hung in the air as she returned to her seat, the weight of her statement sinking into the room. The judge called for a short recess before delivering his verdict. As the courtroom emptied into the hallway, Simone felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Monica, her expression a mixture of gratitude and determination. "Whatever happens in there," Monica said, "you've already won. You gave us a voice." Simone smiled faintly, but before she could respond, a commotion erupted at the far end of the hallway. Officer Brent Wallace had entered the courthouse, his presence instantly commanding attention. His eyes locked onto Simone with a predatory gleam, and he began walking toward her, his steps deliberate and heavy. Marcus stepped in front of Simone instinctively. "What do you want, Wallace?" Wallace smirked, ignoring Marcus. "Dr. Ellison, we need to talk now." Simone met his gaze evenly. "If this is about the nonsense you pulled in the parking lot, I'm not interested." "It's not nonsense," Wallace said, his voice dropping to a menacing tone. "You've been stirring up trouble, and it's time someone put you in your place." Marcus stepped closer, his voice sharp. "Back off, Wallace, you have no authority here." But Wallace didn't budge. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "This," he said, holding it up, "is a warrant. We've received reports of suspicious financial activity tied to your name, Dr. Ellison, embezzlement, fraud, you name it." Simone's stomach clenched, but she kept her composure. "That's absurd. You know those charges are fabricated." Wallace shrugged, his smirk widening. "Maybe they are, but all it takes is one report to ruin a reputation, doesn't it? Kind of ironic, considering what you're trying to do to Westbridge." The weight of his words hit Simone like a freight train. This wasn't just about silencing her, it was about destroying her completely. But even as the realization sank in, her resolve hardened. "Do what you have to do," Simone said, her voice calm but fierce. "But know this, you're not going to win. You can smear my name, drag me through the mud, but the truth will come out, and when it does, it'll bury you." Wallace's smirk faltered, but he recovered quickly. "We'll see about that." The hallway was in chaos as Wallace handed the warrant to another officer, who approached Simone cautiously. Marcus was on his phone, calling every contact he had in the legal system, while Monica stood by Simone's side, her face pale but determined. "Do you have any idea what you're doing?" Monica demanded, glaring at Wallace. "This is harassment, plain and simple." "Just doing my job," Wallace said smugly. As the officers prepared to escort Simone out of the courthouse, a voice rang out behind them. "Wait!" The crowd parted to reveal Judge Cartwright, his robe billowing as he strode toward the group. His expression was stern, his eyes locked onto Wallace. "What is the meaning of this?" the judge demanded. "Just executing a warrant, Your Honor," Wallace said, though his confidence had begun to waver. Judge Cartwright took the warrant from the younger officer and scanned it quickly. His lips pressed into a thin line as he looked back at Wallace. "This warrant is flimsy at best. It's based on unverified claims and lacks proper authorization. It's clear this is an attempt to intimidate Dr. Ellison, and I won't allow my courtroom to be used for such tactics." The crowd murmured in shock as the judge tore the warrant in half, his expression unwavering. Wallace's face turned crimson, but he didn't protest. "Officer Wallace," the judge continued, his voice icy, "if I hear of any further harassment against Dr. Ellison, you will face consequences, am I understood?" Wallace clenched his jaw, nodding tightly. "Yes, Your Honor." Simone felt a wave of relief, but she knew the fight was far from over. As Wallace stormed out of the courthouse, the judge turned to her, his expression softening slightly. "Dr. Ellison," he said, "I'll be delivering my verdict shortly. Stay strong." Back in the courtroom, the tension was palpable as the judge prepared to speak. Simone's heart pounded as he delivered his decision. The evidence presented by Dr. Ellison is compelling and credible. It reveals a pattern of deceit and exploitation by Westbridge Financial. While the defamation claims against Dr. Ellison are dismissed, I am ordering a full investigation into Westbridge's practices regarding their Southside project. The room erupted into chaos. Cheers from Southside residents, angry murmurs from Westbridge supporters. Rachel Collins looked stricken, her carefully constructed image crumbling as the judge's words sealed their fate. Simone exhaled, a mixture of relief and exhaustion washing over her. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. As Simone stepped outside, the crowd greeted her with thunderous applause. Marcus and Monica stood by her side, their expressions triumphant. But amidst the celebration, Simone's gaze drifted to the edge of the crowd, where Wallace lingered in the shadows. His expression was dark, his posture tense. The fight against him, and the system he represented, wasn't over. Simone straightened her shoulders, her resolve renewed. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The courthouse doors swung open, spilling Simone onto the front steps, where a storm of flashing cameras and shouted questions greeted her. Her heart pounded, not from the chaos of the media, but from what lay ahead. The court of public opinion would form its own conclusions based on the judge's ruling, but Simone knew the real battle wasn't over. Westbridge Financial Officer Wallace, and everything they represented, still loomed like a shadow over the city. Marcus and Monica flanked her as they descended the steps, their expressions a mix of triumph and trepidation. But before Simone could make it to her car, the crowd parted to reveal Officer Wallace, leaning against his cruiser with his arms crossed, a smug grin on his face. "Well, well," Wallace drawled, his voice cutting through the noise. "Look who's got herself a little victory lap." Simone stopped, her breath catching in her chest. For a moment, the world around her seemed to fade, leaving only Wallace and the unspoken threat in his eyes. "Not now," Marcus muttered, tugging her arm. "Let's go." But Simone shook him off, her gaze never leaving Wallace. This wasn't the time to walk away, not anymore. "What do you want, Wallace?" she asked, her voice steady, despite the fury bubbling beneath the surface. He pushed off the cruiser, his boots clicking on the pavement as he sauntered closer. "Oh, nothing much. Just thought I'd remind you that one courtroom ruling doesn't change a thing. You think you've won? You haven't even scratched the surface." Simone squared her shoulders, refusing to be intimidated. "I've exposed the truth that's more than you or your kind have ever done." Wallace's smirk twisted into something darker. "You're awfully bold for someone who doesn't know how deep this goes." Westbridge isn't the only one with influence, Dr. Ellison. You've made a lot of enemies. I'm not afraid of you, Simone said firmly. Wallace laughed, the sound cold and hollow. Maybe you should be. The crowd had fallen silent, their attention riveted on the exchange. Simone could feel their eyes on her, the weight of their expectations pressing down. But she refused to falter. You've spent your entire career hiding behind a badge, abusing your authority, and protecting the people who hold this city hostage, Simone said, her voice rising. But your time is up. The system you're clinging to is crumbling, and you know it. Wallace's face darkened, the mask of smugness slipping for the first time. Careful, Ellison. You're playing a dangerous game. Simone stepped closer, her words cutting like a blade. The only danger here is to the people like you who think they can get away with this forever. But I promise you, Wallace, you won't. As the tension thickened, a sharp voice cut through the air. Enough! Simone and Wallace turned to see Rachel Collins stepping forward, her expression tight with barely concealed frustration. Officer Wallace, she said curtly, you're not helping. Wallace sneered but stepped back, his gaze still locked on Simone. Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you. Simone's pulse quickened as Rachel approached, her polished exterior cracking under the weight of the moment. This isn't over, Rachel said quietly, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and desperation. You think you've exposed us? You don't even know the half of it. Then tell me, Simone said, her tone a challenge. Rachel hesitated, her eyes darting around as if weighing her options. Finally, she leaned in, her voice low. Wallace isn't just a rogue cop, he's part of a network, a system that runs deeper than you can imagine. Westbridge is just one piece of it. If you keep digging, you'll find things you can't unsee. Then why not stop them? Simone demanded. You have power, use it. Rachel's lips pressed into a thin line. Because power comes at a price, and you're not the only one there watching. For a moment, Simone saw something almost human in Rachel's eyes. A flicker of fear, regret, or maybe both. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the cold calculation Simone had come to expect. Good luck, Dr. Ellison, Rachel said, turning on her heel. You're going to need it. Simone stood frozen, the weight of Rachel's words sinking in. Marcus touched her arm gently. Simone, we need to go. She nodded, allowing him to lead her to the car. The ride home was silent, tension hanging heavy in the air. When they arrived, Marcus turned to her, his expression serious. Do you believe her? He asked. Simone stared out the window, her mind racing. I don't know, but I can't ignore it. Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair. You're already a target, Simone. If you push any further, they'll come after you harder. Then let them, Simone said, her voice fierce. I didn't come this far to stop now. Later that evening, Simone sat in her study, poring over the evidence she had collected. Emails, contracts, testimonies. They painted a damning picture of Westbridge's corruption. But Rachel's warning echoed in her mind. A network. A system that runs deeper than you can imagine. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She opened it to find Monica, her face pale and drawn. Simone, Monica said, her voice shaking, they're retaliating. What do you mean? Simone asked, stepping aside to let her in. Families in Southside are getting eviction notices, Monica said, her words tumbling out in a rush. Developers are already moving in. It's like they're trying to punish us for standing up. Simone's stomach twisted. They're accelerating their plans. Monica nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. We don't know what to do. People are terrified. Simone placed a hand on Monica's shoulder, her resolve hardening. We fight back, we organize, we protest. We expose them for who they really are. They think they can scare us into submission, but they're wrong. Monica wiped her eyes, a flicker of hope returning to her expression. What do you need from me? Everything you've got, Simone said. Records, testimonies, anything that shows what they're doing. We're going to make this public, and we're going to make it impossible for them to hide. As the night wore on, Simone and Monica worked tirelessly, compiling evidence and reaching out to allies. By dawn, they had a plan. A press conference to reveal the full extent of Westbridge's corruption, backed by the voices of Southside residents who refused to be silenced. But as Simone prepared for the confrontation ahead, She couldn't shake the feeling that Rachel's warning had been more than a veiled threat. The network she hinted at was still lurking in the shadows, waiting for its moment to strike. Simone glanced at her phone, her finger hovering over Marcus's number. She knew she couldn't fight this battle alone, but she also knew that asking for help would put everyone she cared about at risk. With a deep breath, she made the call. "Marcus," she said when he picked up. "I need you." The stage was set. The press conference would be the moment where Simone took her stand, but the uncertainty of what lay ahead loomed large. Wallace, Rachel, and the forces they represented were still out there, and the stakes had never been higher. Simone stared at her reflection in the mirror, her expression steely. This was it. The point of no return. Whatever came next, she was ready. The press conference was held on the steps of City Hall, the very heart of Westbridge's political and social power. Simone stood before a sea of reporters, cameras flashing, microphones thrust toward her. Behind her, the residents of Southside gathered in solidarity, their faces a mix of hope and determination. Monica stood at Simone's side, holding a stack of documents that outlined the systematic corruption tied to Westbridge Financial. Beside them, Marcus scanned the crowd, his phone in hand, ready to livestream the event. This wasn't just a moment for Westbridge, it was a moment for the entire city to confront its conscience. Simone stepped up to the podium, the weight of her responsibility pressing on her shoulders. But as she looked out at the crowd, she felt her resolve solidify. This was why she fought not for herself, but for the countless voices that had been silenced for far too long. "Good morning," Simone began, her voice clear and steady. "I stand here today not as a doctor, not as a public figure, but as a member of this community. Over the past weeks, we've uncovered a web of corruption and exploitation orchestrated by Westbridge Financial. Their so-called redevelopment project is nothing more than a calculated scheme to displace vulnerable families for profit." She paused, letting her words sink in. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder as reporters scribbled notes and whispered into their microphones. "We have the evidence," Simone continued. "Emails, contracts, and testimonies that prove their intent to destroy Southside and its people. But this isn't just about one neighborhood, it's about a system that prioritizes the powerful over the powerless, profit over people, and silence over accountability." Monica stepped forward, handing Simone a document. Simone held it up for the cameras. "This is a contract signed by Westbridge Financial executives, outlining their plan to evict residents and sell the land to private developers. These are the voices they tried to silence. Mothers, fathers, children who call Southside their home. But today, their voices will be heard." The crowd erupted in applause, the residents of Southside cheering loudly. Simone's heart swelled as she saw the hope in their eyes. As the press conference continued, the tide began to shift. Reporters grilled Rachel Collins and Westbridge's representatives, who had been forced to attend under public pressure. Their polished answers faltered under the weight of Simone's evidence, their carefully constructed narrative unraveling before the cameras. Rachel's composure cracked as a reporter asked her directly about the leaked emails. "Did you approve these plans, Ms. Collins?" the reporter demanded. "And if so, how do you justify them?" Rachel hesitated, her mask of professionalism slipping. These plans were preliminary. They were never meant to," Simone cut in, her voice sharp. "They were never meant to be exposed. That's what you mean, isn't it?" Rachel's face turned red, and she opened her mouth to respond, but the damage was done. The crowd's murmurs turned to shouts, demanding accountability. Westbridge's representatives began to retreat, their power eroding with every passing second. Just as Simone thought the worst was behind her, a familiar figure emerged from the crowd. Officer Wallace strode forward, his expression thunderous. He ignored the cameras and the growing tension in the air, his focus solely on Simone. "You think this is over?" Wallace snarled, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "You think you can just waltz in here, tear everything down, and walk away?" Simone met his gaze, her expression calm but firm. "It's not about walking away, Wallace, it's about standing up." Wallace scoffed, but his bravado faltered as Marcus stepped forward, holding up his phone. "Smile for the camera, Wallace," Marcus said, his tone sharp. "The whole city's watching." Wallace hesitated, his eyes darting to the cameras. He knew he couldn't act without consequences, but his fury was palpable. "This isn't the end," Wallace muttered. Before turning and disappearing into the crowd, Simone let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. But she knew Wallace's retreat wasn't a victory. Not yet. Over the next few days, the fallout from the press conference was swift and far-reaching. The evidence Simone and Monica had presented led to an official investigation into Westbridge financial public outcry, forced the city council to halt the redevelopment project, and several high-ranking executives, including Rachel Collins, resigned under pressure. Officer Wallace wasn't spared either. A formal complaint was filed against him, citing harassment and abuse of power. His superiors placed him on administrative leave, pending an internal review. But Simone suspected it was only a matter of time before he faced more serious consequences. For Southside, the victory was bittersweet. The immediate threat had been stopped, but the scars of the fight remained. Families who had been on the brink of eviction were left grappling with the uncertainty of their future, and the neighborhood's trust in the system was fractured. Simone spent her days meeting with community leaders, organizing resources, and ensuring that Southside's residents had the support they needed. Her victory had come at a cost, but it also sparked something she hadn't anticipated: a movement. One evening, as Simone walked through Southside, she was stopped by a young girl holding a homemade sign. The sign read, "Thank you, Dr. Ellison." Simone knelt to the girl's level, her heart swelling with emotion. "What's your name?" she asked. "Maria," the girl said shyly. "My mom said you helped us stay in our house." Simone smiled, her throat tight with emotion. "Maria, your mom is the real hero. I just did what I could." As Maria ran back to her family, Simone stood, her resolve stronger than ever. This wasn't just about Southside. It was about every community that had been overlooked and underestimated, and Simone wasn't done fighting. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects of Simone's actions spread throughout the city. Activists rallied around her, using her story as a catalyst for broader reform. The city council passed new measures to protect vulnerable neighborhoods from predatory development, and a grassroots coalition formed to hold officials accountable. Simone's name became synonymous with resilience and justice, but she didn't let the accolades distract her. The fight was far from over, and she was ready for whatever came next. As Simone sat in her office one evening, a text from Marcus lit up her phone. "Marcus, you did it, but there's more to uncover. Call me when you're ready." Simone stared at the message, her mind racing. The network Rachel had hinted at still loomed in the background, and Simone knew she couldn't stop until the full truth was revealed. She typed a response, her fingers steady. "Simone, I'll be ready." The fight wasn't over, but Simone Ellison was just getting started. The quiet of Simone's study was a stark contrast to the chaos of the past weeks. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, illuminating the papers scattered across her desk. Reports from the investigation into Westbridge Financial, letters of gratitude from Southside residents, and notes for the next steps in her fight for justice were a testament to how far she had come and how much work was still ahead. Simone leaned back in her chair, staring out the window. The neighborhood was alive with activity. Children playing in the street, neighbors chatting on porches, the hum of life continuing, despite the battles they had faced. Southside was still standing, its spirit unbroken. That alone was a victory worth celebrating. But the journey had changed. Simone. She wasn't the same person who had walked into Joe's diner that morning, quietly grappling with the subtle injustices she had long grown used to. This fight had forced her to confront not just the biases of others, but the deep-rooted systems that perpetuated them. It had tested her resolve, her patience, and her belief in the power of truth. She had emerged stronger, not unscarred, but stronger. Marcus arrived later that afternoon, his usual easygoing demeanor tempered by the seriousness of their conversation. He dropped into the chair across from Simone, a knowing look on his face. "You look like you're 100 miles away," he said. Simone smiled faintly. "Just thinking about everything that's happened, about what's next." Marcus nodded, leaning forward. "You know you can't stop now. Rachel's warning wasn't just a scare tactic. There's more to uncover." "I know," Simone said, her voice steady. "And I'm ready." Marcus studied her for a moment, then nodded. You've always been the stubborn one, guess that's what makes you good at this. Simone chuckled softly, but her expression quickly turned serious. It's not just about me, Marcus. It's about everyone who's been silenced, overlooked, and pushed aside. If I stop now, what message does that send? That the fight doesn't end with one person, Marcus said. But it starts with one. Simone thought about his words long after he left. He was right. The fight for justice wasn't hers alone, but she had a responsibility to keep pushing forward, to keep shining a light in the dark corners where corruption and prejudice thrived. As the days turned into weeks, the fallout from the Westbridge investigation continued to ripple through the city. Executives faced charges, and the redevelopment project was officially dismantled. For Southside residents, it was a moment of relief, but also a reminder of how precarious their safety and stability remained. Simone threw herself into the work, partnering with local activists and organizations to build lasting change. They hosted town halls, rallied for stronger protections against predatory development, and lobbied for systemic reforms in policing and housing. The movement grew, drawing attention from national media and inspiring other communities to take action. Simone became a symbol of resilience and defiance, but she was careful to keep the focus on the collective effort. This wasn't about her, it was about all of them. One evening, Simone visited Maria's family. Their modest home was filled with the sounds of laughter and the aroma of a home-cooked meal. Maria's mother, Anna, hugged Simone tightly when she arrived. "You saved us," Anna said, tears in her eyes. "We thought we'd lose everything, but because of you, we have hope." Simone shook her head, her voice soft. "It wasn't just me. It was all of us, standing together." Maria tugged on Simone's sleeve, holding up a crayon drawing of Simone standing in front of a cheering crowd above it. Maria had written in block letters, "Our hero." Simone's throat tightened as she knelt to Maria's level. "You're the hero, Maria. Never forget that." As she left the house that night, Simone felt a renewed sense of purpose. The struggle had taken so much from her, but it had also given her something priceless, a connection to the people she was fighting for, and a vision of what was possible when they stood together. The broader implications of Simone's fight were impossible to ignore. The investigation into Westbridge Financial revealed a tangled web of corruption that extended far beyond Southside. Public officials, business leaders, and law enforcement officers were implicated, forcing the city to confront uncomfortable truths about its institutions. But change was slow, and resistance was inevitable. For every step forward, there were forces pushing back, clinging to the status quo. Simone knew this wasn't a battle that could be won overnight. It was a war of attrition, fought in courtrooms, boardrooms, and streets, and it required an army of people willing to challenge the system at every turn. Simone's own transformation was evident in the way she carried herself. She no longer felt the need to shrink in the face of scrutiny or doubt. Her voice was clear, her presence commanding. But she also understood the importance of balance, of finding moments of peace amid the chaos. One evening, as she walked through Southside, she paused at a mural that had recently been painted on the side of a building. It depicted a group of residents holding hands, their faces lifted toward a bright, rising sun. At the center of the mural was a figure that looked unmistakably like Simone, her arm raised in defiance. She smiled, her heart swelling with pride. The mural wasn't just a tribute, it was a promise. A promise that they would keep fighting, no matter what. Simone's journey had started with a quiet sense of unease, a recognition of the injustices that permeated her world. But it had grown into something far greater, a movement that challenged the very foundations of power and privilege. She had learned that resilience wasn't just about enduring, it was about pushing back, about refusing to accept the unacceptable. And she had seen the power of collective action, the way ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when they came together. As she stood before the mural, the city lights flickering in the distance, Simone allowed herself a moment of reflection. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, she felt hope. Hope for Southside. Hope for the city. And hope for a future where justice wasn't just an ideal, but a reality.